I trust that, I'm going to start pacing because this is me in my natural environment here. I trust that many of you have at least taken a glance at the Great Decisions piece this year on the U.S.-Cuba relations. It's sort of where we are in 2016. And so I'm going to end where we are in 2016, but I actually want to start at the start, which effectively means starting in pretty much U.S. independence. That from the moment we become independent or shortly thereafter, the U.S. is already beginning to look to Cuba as part of a natural part of a growing United States. That as early as the John Adams, the second president of the United States of America, and Thomas Jefferson, both thought that eventually Cuba would just naturally become a part of the United States because of its proximity. And sort of this, if we have the things like the Louisiana Purchase with Jefferson, that clearly the United States from an early point on is an expansive power, that Cuba would naturally fall into that sort of arena. And perhaps the early, fullest expression of this is with John Quincy Adams, who's Secretary of State under James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. And I've got the quotation here, right, that he sort of believed this is almost Newtonian physics here, that Cuba is an apple that is just naturally going to gravitate to the United States over time. And that becomes an issue particularly for Quincy Adams because that's when Spanish-American countries are gaining their independence. From, between basically 1821 and 1824, every Spanish-American country gains its independence except Cuba and Puerto Rico, which remain Spanish colonies. But John Quincy Adams very early on thinks that it's just a matter of time before the United States will also acquire Cuba for itself. And there are many efforts early on to try to acquire Cuba. That at first we think it will become independent too, and then we can just have it be a part of the United States. But by the mid-1800s, we've discovered that Cuba has this very annoying habit of continuing to be Spanish. And so you start to get more direct, assertive attempts to make Cuba a part of the United States. In 1848, James K. Polk, coming off of the Mexican-American War, offers Spain $100 million to purchase the island. And Spain politely declines. But the U.S. continues to lust after it, sometimes literally, right? That you have editorialists calling for Cuba to become a part of the United States, whether it wants to or not, or whether the Spanish want to give it to us or not. So this is sort of an almost grotesque quotation here, right? But that this guy's sort of envisioning Cuba as this young maiden that is just inevitably going to fall into Uncle Sam's lap in an almost, dare I say, quasi-pornographic fashion, right? That sort of the old Uncle Sam is ready to take young, beautiful Cuba, the jewel of the Caribbean, into the bedroom so that they can sort of consummate this natural marriage that was supposed to happen a long time ago. And you'll have more overt, it's not just these sort of discursive calls for Cuba to become a part of the United States. You have sincere efforts that in 1850, a former Spanish officer named Narciso Lopez will end up fleeing to the United States and mustering an army of about 600 mercenaries, mostly American citizens, to go and invade Cuba, ostensibly for its independence, but with the goal of get it independent from Spain and immediately have it become a part of the United States. And ultimately that effort fails, but it enjoys a broad support from the United States, and especially from the South. That by 1850, the Deep South is very interested in Cuba becoming a part of the United States because it can help the expansion of slavery. And Cuba has, of course, this massive sugar industry that the United States is already the main consumer of Cuban sugar by this point. Lopez's effort fails the first time, but he tries again in 1851. He doesn't try again after 1851 because he gets captured and the Spanish execute him. But that doesn't stop efforts to plan an invasion of Cuba. That the governor of Mississippi, John Quitman, picks up the efforts that end with Lopez's death and spends several years organizing and fundraising to launch another private army expedition into Cuba to gain its independence from Spain. It ultimately doesn't come to fruition, in part because the president at the time, Franklin Pierce, asks him not to do that. But it's not because Pierce doesn't want Cuba. Pierce just prefers more diplomatic mechanisms. So that in 1854, Pierce's ambassadors to Great Britain, France, and Spain will meet in Belgium and issue a declaration that says if Spain doesn't sell Cuba, the United States would be justified in taking it. And it appeals to the Monroe Doctrine on this front, right? That this is the first time we sort of see the Monroe Doctrine become this political tool. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine had simply said that any European country interfering in the affairs of the Americas, it will be considered an attack against any one country. This will be considered an attack against all of the countries of the Americas, and the United States will act appropriately. And it's sort of this idea of there are two spheres in the world. The Americas are the United States sphere. The other part of the world, Europe, you can play there all you want, and the United States will not get involved in your playground. You stay out of our playground. And when Monroe issues this declaration, written also by John Quincy Adams, it's, first of all, it's a very loud bark from a very small dog at that time. Because the United States can say, if you come over here, we're going to fight you. But our Navy in 1823 and the British Navy in 1823 are not exactly on an equal playing field, right? So we sort of say this without necessarily the military strength to back it up, but Europe basically listens. But Monroe had issued it in part because he's worried about Spain trying to retake all of its independent countries. That's sort of the original conceptualization of the Monroe Doctrine. But now by the 1850s, you have politicians pointing to the Monroe Doctrine in terms beyond how Monroe had sort of articulated it. So they say, if Spain doesn't sell it to us, we can take it because of the Monroe Doctrine. That ultimately doesn't take off because two of those three ambassadors are Southerners and slaveholders. And Northerners quickly react against this idea because they don't like the idea of slavery expanding. James Buchanan himself had promised to try to get Cuba. He says that if I can end the slavery question and get Cuba, I will have a successful presidency. Of course, his presidency ends with the Civil War beginning and no Cuba, so there's a reason why he often ends up at the bottom of the list of presidents for any number of reasons, and that's one of those. And this is very much thus far a U.S. top-down, right? So the U.S. acting toward Cuba, but there's already a lot of contact going, and one of the key things to keep in mind throughout U.S.-Cuban relations is it's a two-way street. It's more than just government actors, and there is a lot more going on than simple politicians can handle, or sometimes create themselves. So that you're getting a broader cultural exchange, that a lot of the sugar elites in Cuba are already bound to the United States economically. They begin to send their children to college there. And so these young men go off to college in the United States, and they'll bring back cultural artifacts from the United States, like baseball. Right, that is sort of seen as this refined, civilized, white, middle-class culture that's appropriate for Cuba to incorporate. And as we know now, right, the number of baseball players coming to the United States, often sort of fleeing Cuba and entering the United States, Cuba is a really powerful baseball country, in part that has its origins in the same time, that even while the United States is trying to bring Cuba into the U.S. political culture, there are elements of American culture that Cuba is actually bringing into Cuba itself. Obviously, when we have a civil war, it kind of puts Cuba on the back burner for us. But it becomes an issue quickly after the Civil War because Cuba actually launches a war for independence. From 1868 to 1878, for a lack of originality, they called it the 10 Years' War. And it's, you would think this is a thing the United States is extremely interested in. Finally, Cuba wants its independence. We can get behind that. The United States sits it out. It wants no part of it because, in part, it's a social revolution. It's not just that they're fighting for independence, but it's the lower classes and the slaves rising up to kick the Spanish out. And that would disrupt U.S. sugar commerce and disrupt the interests of the economic elites tied to Cuba. So they actually are very quiet after demanding Cuban independence for over 50 years. When Cuba starts to say, we do want independence, those elites in the United States who've been calling for it get very quiet about it. And it's an absolutely devastating war that 100,000 people die in the course of this 10-year war in Cuba. It just ravages the population. But that's not going to be the end of the issue. That obviously, and this is the part that probably begins to sound a little more familiar, in 1895, Cuba tries again. That the sort of failed effort of the 10 Years' War leads to a grander sense of nationalism within Cuba. That you have figures emerge like Jose Marti, who now are not only conceptualizing of an independent Cuba in terms of independent from Spain, but one that's independent from the United States as well, and from the United States' influence. That because the U.S. has been so involved in the sugar trade and sort of this system, not directly, the U.S. is not responsible for these social inequalities in Cuba, but by being so implicitly tied to the economic system that has created those inequalities, a lot of Cubans sort of are not huge fans of the United States. And Jose Marti becomes one of the better interlocutors of this position, that he has this really famous essay about our America. Where he sort of talks about our America, the Spanish America, not just Cuba, but all of Latin America, operates in a fundamentally different way than the United States. That the United States is greedy, it's materialistic, it's godless. because it doesn't have Catholicism. Whereas our America has these sort of rich cultural, spiritual values that we're more passionate, we're less obsessed with material wealth. So already we're getting this framing of our America versus the United States, not in terms of antagonism or military, but the mere question of these are two different spheres that cannot connect. And Martí will die early in what we come to call the Spanish-American War, or more appropriately, the Cuban War for Independence. But his ideas will become very influential across time for reasons that we'll see here in a few minutes. One of the people that Fidel Castro will quote the most is Jose Martí. And it's not because of any sense of communism or anything we would associate with Cold War ideology. It's because of this idea of a Cuba operating on its own, independent of the influence of any outside powers, Spanish, United States, or others. With the beginning of the Cuban War for Independence in 1895, the United States is again very hesitant to get involved. The Spanish refused to give up the colony because at this point in the world history, if you want to show your country's strength, you're acquiring territories, you're not losing them, right? The British in Africa and India, the United States eventually in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the French in Africa and in Southeast Asia, that's how you're showing your nation is strong. To lose a colony would be devastating for your international reputation. So Spain determines it's going to fight tooth and nail to keep Cuba. The United States, again, is very hesitant to get involved because the rebels are using scorched earth tactics to try to hit Spain in its pocketbook, but because the United States is the main sugar market for Cuba, it's also hitting U.S. merchants in their pocketbooks. Business leaders actually warned President McKinley that the rebellion is costing them $100 million a year in business, right? That this isn't a question of independence, it's a question of the bottom line for the United States. There's also a threat, though, because it's, again, lower class. It's the middle class and the lower classes rising up in revolt against Cuba. And in the 1890s in the United States, the notion of popular classes rising to overthrow a government is really disconcerting. And so you end up having McKinley kind of wanting to figure out how to get involved, that maybe this is our chance to take Cuba, but he can't seem to figure out the way. And that's where the press will come in. Journalists in the media empires of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer will really work heavily to fan the flames of U.S. sentiment in favor of the Cuban freedom fighters, as they put it. So that you have this one incident in which Spaniards intercept a boat going to Cuba and make the people do a strip search in order to make sure they're not smuggling anything in. And the media in the United States will jump on this, and you have this image of this pure white woman with these much swarthier men who are supposed to be Spanish, clearly defiling her honor. And won't somebody think of the Cubans and the women? To try to drum up public support, right? There's that apocryphal but classic line from Hearst who told McKinley, if you give me the headlines, I'll give you the war. Give me a pretext to drum up the public's anger towards Spain, and I'll give you the public support for a war. And that will ultimately happen in 1898. That by January of 1898, Cuba is poised to defeat the Spanish. The Spanish have just launched an absolutely devastating borderline genocidal campaign that's been ineffective in terms of actually accomplishing the submission of the Cuban people, but sure has made them hate the Spanish even more and cost Spain a lot of money. So Spain is basically acknowledging that it's about to lose this war. And that's where the United States comes in. This is how someone in Cuba will see this image, as sort of this greedy Uncle Sam reaching to pull Cuba into his embrace, which I can't imagine where they would have gotten that idea from previous generations. Some in the United States are critical of this, that McKinley's just trying to carve up parts of the world so that the United States can consume it. So here's Waiter McKinley giving Uncle Sam the finest cuts from the Cuba steak, the Puerto Rico pig, the Philippine floating islands, and the Sandwich Islands. And, oh, what will I eat next? Right? This sort of internal imperialist critique. But some openly support the war, and it really escalates in February of 1898, when a U.S. ship, the USS Maine, is in Havana port, and it blows up. And immediately we say, this is all the Spaniards' fault. We have to declare war on Spain because they have dared to attack us. That's almost certainly what did not happen, in part because the U.S. ambassador had actually been dining with the Spanish general, the leader of the Spanish armed forces in Cuba, just the week before. And ultimately what they figured happened in this explosion that kills hundreds of sailors is, for some reason, someone thought open flame near the gunpowder was a good idea. And why not, let's put the gunpowder in the exact middle of the boat so that if something were to happen, the whole thing goes up. So that's almost certainly what happens, but Hearst and Pulitzer have the headlines now, they can give McKinley the war. And so they basically, this gets framed as, oh my God, they've attacked it, it's about time we helped the Cubans, and the United States declares war on Spain. But again, it's primarily to extend our influence in the region. It's part of this broader sort of what's at the time referred to as this imperialist project on the part of the United States to acquire territories to show its own national strength. And by April, McKinley had asked for and received Congress's declaration of war, commenting that the war in Cuba, quote, threatens the Cuban lives, U.S. property, and the tranquility of the United States itself. And so we send men off to war. It's going to be a good old time. And Theodore Roosevelt's thrilled. He feels America's gotten soft around the belly. It needs a good war to whip itself into shape, and here comes that war. It doesn't go so well. We do win the war fairly quickly. You actually have, it reveals how unprepared for the United States is. That the War Department gives soldiers neither proper training nor adequate equipment. They're not given tents. They're not giving mess kits. It does give them clothing. They get woolen uniforms for Cuba in July. Because who doesn't want to wear a long-sleeved wool outfit in Cuba in July? We also give rancid and maggot-infested canned meat. It's bad enough that there are 2,900 U.S. soldiers who die in the Spanish-American War. I'll get it right here eventually. The Spanish-American War, 2,500 of those come from the rations. It's so bad that the regulatory state, such as it is, says we should probably start actually monitoring meat production in the United States because it's killing our soldiers. By August, the Spanish signed a peace treaty. And we've pretty much written the Cubans out of this from the start, right? That across nearly 3 years, they had nearly gained their independence of their own accord. But the moment we declare war, it's the Spanish-American War. There's nothing said about Cuba. It disregards the fact that Cubans have been fighting this fight for 3 years. It's merely a question of, well, Spain and the United States fought, and now we get to have spoils of war, and that will be Cuba. We governed Cuba as a military colony for 3 years. And then we finally allow them to write their constitution. But we pass in U.S. Congress something known as the Platt Amendment, which says your constitution is approved, but the United States can intervene in Cuba whenever it feels it needs to preserve independence. And so the Platt Amendment basically becomes a carte blanche for to nominally strip Cuba of any notion of independence. It's bad enough that the guy who is the military governor of Cuba, the U.S. representative governing Cuba, when they pass the Platt Amendment, says Cuba effectively has no independence now. And the Platt Amendment will become the vehicle for constant U.S. intervention. That in 1907 they have an election, but the United States doesn't like the way it turns out, so we intervene, or 1906 rather, so we intervene, and we remain there from 1906 to 1909 with military troops on the ground. They do it again in 1912. The U.S. sends the army back in. The United States is again in Cuba from 1917 to 1922. So that you have this constant sense of intervention. Cuba is nominally an independent country, but one that that apple has fallen closer to the ground of the United States than perhaps it wanted. The problem is I have all these slides and I forget what I've included in here because I can't look at that. It is very much a paternalistic project. So that we sort of view this as, we defend this as, well, this doesn't go against our democratic ideals because we're civilizing them. And this sort of perfectly, this is one of my favorite images ever because it perfectly summarizes at that time US racial attitudes across the board. Because Uncle Sam's going to teach you how to be civilized. We know it works and it's hard to read, but the books you see over here of all the white children are Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. That once they got that school learning that Uncle Sam can provide, they became these nice white civilized kids. We have these black kids up here now, these dark-skinned ones, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, etc. But with our education, They too can become like that. Of course, the Chinese kid at the door can't come in because the Chinese Exclusion Act is in effect at that time, saying Chinese immigrants are not allowed. The Indian kid can't even read, doesn't even know how to hold a book. He's beyond hope. And the African American kid, beyond being a gross racist stereotype, is only in the classroom to clean the windows, right? So this is sort of the US's attitude towards not just imperial acquisitions at this time, but it's sort of a perfect encapsulation of US attitudes on race at that time. We will continue to sort of, I can't think of a better way to put it right now, give democracy and independence a bad name in Cuba throughout the 1920s, so that they will have a particularly horrible president in the mid-1920s. His name was Gerardo Machado. He acquired the office in 1925, and he uses his power to make himself forever unbeatable at the ballot box. He's horribly corrupt. He siphons off the top. He uses police to go after those who would question his authority. And the United States sits by and does nothing because he's working with the US. You know, he's protecting US economic interests, so he's an acceptable democratic leader. That will change with the Great Depression, which obviously transforms the United States. It transforms the United States' place in the world, and it transforms US-Cuba relations, because Cuba had been so dependent on the sugar market to the United States. But the Great Depression leads to a set of tariffs, Congress imposing a set of tariffs that basically strip Cuba of its ability to import sugar. And so the Cuban economy bottoms out. And in this context, and by 1933, students, labor leaders, middle-class reformers, and disgruntled politicians who all hated Machado come up with various plots to overthrow him. And the police crack down and start to execute these movements, and the US sits by. And in 1933, finally, the public anger cannot be stopped. 20,000 Cuban workers go on strike because the Great Depression has so devastated their livelihood. And they managed to overthrow Machado, who flees Cuba. But with him gone, the opposition forces themselves now split, and young radicals dominate. That they've had 28, 29, I guess 32 at this point, years of the Platt Amendment. They want a clean, pure break with the United States. They want a government that's more equal across the board. They want an economic system that's more equal for the workers. And so they fragment. You get these more radical groups of politicians and leaders coming into power. You actually get the formation of Soviets of their own accord. It's not that the Russians are in Cuba, but Cuban workers begin to form their own sort of workers' collectives to try to assert their power and fight for more equal rights. And in this context, there's a new civilian leader, Ramon Grau San Martin, who you see here in his later years. He becomes temporary president, and he proclaims a social revolution. And even though Franklin Roosevelt wants to abandon the old policies, this cannot stand. And so he ends up sending the military to block the Cuban coast and sort of pressures Cuba into removing Grau San Martin and bringing in a guy named Fulgencio Batista to become the president. And as soon as that happens, and we're assured that there will be no social revolution in Cuba, we abrogate the Platt Amendment. That this will begin the era of sort of what's known as good neighbor relations, the good neighbor policy for Roosevelt, where we don't just barge into any Latin American country we want on a whim. But it has to take one more intervention in Cuba before we can abrogate that Platt Amendment entirely. That really ushers in the era that we could call safely the Batista era, because Batista will dominate Cuban politics from 1934 until 1959. He either runs the country directly himself as president or through puppet presidents. One of those puppet presidents will be San Martin. He'll bring him into office, but now San Martin has been totally chastened, and he basically knows that he can use corruption to pay off the people who let him be president, and he can get to dip in the kitty himself. And so you have a middle class in Cuba that's becoming increasingly angry, because even with the abrogation of the Platt Amendment, it still seems like a bunch of corrupt politicians who work with US interests and business interests in Cuba tied to the United States are denying them political power. The fact that it's the middle class is important because they don't get to vote. They just want to have direct elections, but they feel that they're being shut out of this. And so you'll have a number of movements that try to challenge the Batista years. That in a really famous incident, a guy named Eddie Chibas, who's the head of an opposition party, uses his radio program to rail against the hypocrisy and corruption in Cuban politics, and he launches some really wild, unsubstantiated charges against Grau San Martin. And when he can't produce the proof, he instead goes on the radio telling Cubans to rise up. He gives this long address, and he sort of finishes up his radio address with, "Comrades of Orthodoxy," his party, "forward, sweep away the thieves in government," and then people listening to the radio would have heard a pistol shot ring out to suggest that he's been attacked for daring to challenge the government. He'd taken the pistol himself and shot himself in the stomach to try to make it look like they were attacking him so that people would take to the streets. It was a bad idea, not just because he shot himself, but because the radio had actually gone off the air, the program had gone over and has just gone off the air about 30 seconds before he shot himself. He dies 10 days later, but it taps into the anger and resentment over this regime. And it's in that context that a young college student, a Catholic university-trained college student named Fidel Castro comes into the picture. He is one of these groups, oops, I forgot I have this. We'll go back to Grau San Martin here a second. He is one of those groups, it's not that dirty. He's one of those groups who's very critical of he's not pro-communist. He's not even anti-capitalist. He's drawing on Jose Marti. He's reading those books about our America, and the writings for an independent Cuba saying we might have gotten it in name, we don't have it in effect, right? That Cuba has become a playground for Americans. That while you have crushing poverty next to casinos, it's rich white gringos coming down to Cuba who are only allowed in those casinos, in those yacht clubs. So that everyday Cubans are seeing these images of extreme wealth where you can just throw away money next to extreme poverty, and these debauched tourists coming down just for a good time, and none of the benefits of this end up in the Cuban people's hands. And so drawing on this and having seen the power of the masses, Fidel just happens to be in Colombia in 1948 when you have this huge uprising. And it's impressed upon him the power of popular mobilization. And so he leads, there's the gold, I forget, the golden telephone. That's how corrupt it is, that ITT actually gives Batista a gold telephone as a thank you for letting ITT have a monopoly in Cuba, where they can then charge exorbitant prices to use the phone. So Fidel launches a revolt. Oops, I just wiped out my microphone. Hopefully it'll stay here. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. Fidel launches a revolt in 1953. It fails miserably. Over 100 men go basically attack the Moncada barracks, and 19 survive. And Fidel and his brother Raul are two of the survivors. They're put on trial. Fidel gives what will come to be an infamous, one of his typical Fidel speeches that goes on and on and on. But in the course of his defense, he says, "History will absolve me."
Is that Fidel on the left?
That is Fidel here, yes, sitting down, being sort of questioned in the course of the trial. Without a beard, yes. He did not always have the beard.
Pretty handsome devil back in or so.
And so, but after 11 months, Batista decides he'll try to look like a humanitarian to the world, so he amnesties Fidel. He says, "Leave the country, but I'll let you out of jail." And Fidel heads off to Mexico, where he will meet a young man by the name of Che Guevara. Che happened to be in Mexico because he had been in Guatemala. He'd sort of been traveling around Latin America, seeing how inequality looks in different parts of the world, and becoming more and more upset at how this really does seem unjust. And he couldn't quite put his finger on who's responsible, but it bothered him. And while he's in Guatemala, he's there to help see the CIA overthrow a popularly elected, democratically elected president who had promised land reform. And the United States under Eisenhower, this threatens the United Fruit Company's business holdings, especially now the Chiquita Banana Company. And when the head of the CIA and the Secretary of State are lawyers who had worked for the firm that represented the United Fruit Company, we decide that land reform is communism, and we overthrow the democratically elected president. Only the second democratically elected president in Guatemala's history. And Che is there to see that. So he flees Guatemala because he doesn't want to be on this scene, and now he has a face to put to the crushing inequality in the world, and it's the United States. And while in Mexico, he meets Fidel, who has his own particular Cuban perspective on it, and they begin plotting. And they launch another revolution in Cuba, that they decide to reinvade from Mexico. They get on a small boat called the Granma, and they head off to Cuba in 1956. According to Fell's version, Everyone gets killed except for Fidel and 12 guys who head off into the mountains. Gee, a bearded guy leading 12 others. Where have I heard this story before? It's not an accidental symbolism. It's actually 19 who follow Fidel into the mountains. And they become a problem for Batista because he can't find them. They're a tiny force, but one of the key elements that helps them gain strength is the reporting of Herbert Matthews for the New York Times. Now, Herbert Matthews goes to Cuba and is sort of led behind the lines and interviews Fidel. And paints the picture of a very charismatic man who's very open that this is a nationalist movement. We simply want independence and a greater say in our economy and society and politics. And Fidel plays the game well, so he has various guys coming back and forth saying they're different groups and even changing clothes. So it looks like he has a much bigger army than he does, and Herbert Matthews it's not his fault, he wasn't a sucker, but he falls for it. He sort of sees groups coming in from over there and then different guys coming in from there and then these other guys. It's the same guys, but he thinks it's been, it's triple the numbers. And the world now sees that Fidel is actually this really articulate, eloquent, charismatic guy, and he seems to be fighting for the right stuff, whereas Batista just seems to be kind of a crook. And that getting broadcast around the world gets rebroadcast back in Cuba then, because it wasn't going to get published in Cuba originally, but if it's being published in the New York Times, Cuba was curious to see how is America talking about Cuba. And so now you have those discontent middle classes seeing, wait, there's a movement working. Batista can't fight him. So you start to get movements forming in the cities of Cuba, also challenging Batista's regime. In response, Batista will escalate the repression so that he starts to go after anybody who he thinks might be affiliated with this revolutionary movement, even while the rebels continue to survive. And the longer they survive, the more popular they become and the more adherents they attract, which makes Batista repress even further, so that Batista now looks like the worst kind of dictator, one who's simultaneously incompetent and brutal. He's brutal, and he can't even get rid of the guys he's being brutal to get rid of. So by 1958, the United States is actually trying to figure out how can we keep that system in place but get rid of Batista. So we'll declare an embargo on the whole island saying we're not supporting Batista or the rebels with weapons. We're not providing either group with weapons. But we're basically distancing ourselves from Batista because we weren't giving the rebels weapons to begin with. It's this facade of fairness, but really it's sending Batista a message. Throughout 1958, Batista's army continues to get humiliated in the mountains, and by the end of the year, he's out. He meets, if you've seen Godfather Part 2, the scene where everyone's getting on a plane, that's a fairly accurate representation of what happens. Batista meets with his cabinet on the night of December 30th, says, good luck, I'm out, and gets on a plane and leaves on December 31st. So on January 1st of 1959, Fidel Castro and the rebels roll into Havana. Not present in any of this is the Cuban Communist Party, who felt that Castro was going about things all wrong and that revolution was not the way to effect change in Cuba, that you had to work within the system. And they distanced themselves from Castro very, very much. And Castro doesn't really share any love for the Cuban Communist Party either. Once in power, Castro launches revolutionary changes for better and for worse. There are a number of very rapid trials and executions, about 500, mostly of Batista officials who had been the ones ordering the crackdowns on the Cuban people before. That's not necessarily to defend it. They are open trials. Fair is a more dubious matter. Che Guevara in particular becomes famous for being willing to pull the trigger. In fact, one of the early revolutionaries says that one of the distinctions between Che and myself was Che could look through the sight on the gun and pull the trigger because he saw an enemy of the revolution. I looked through the sight of the gun and I saw a man with a family. Right? So that you do have sort of this crackdown, and the U.S. begins to react immediately. We say, you can't do this, that we start to cut off Cuba from more and more stuff, more and more goods. It's a bigger and bigger embargo, which forces Cuba to have to look elsewhere. And everyone's caught off guard when the Soviet Union steps in and says, if you're looking for trade partners, we'll buy some of your sugar. And Castro needs to sell the sugar, so he says, sure. And now the United States is convinced this guy's a communist. He wants to do land reform, and he's working with the Soviet Union. Clearly, he's just a patsy. And so we launch a program oops, I forgot, that was there twice. We launched an attempt. We tried to turn to Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, and this is why Guatemala matters, because the CIA was able to get a handful of people in Guatemala and get the president out and put a guy in office they liked. And they were able to do the same in Iran with the Shah of Iran in 1953, so it'll work fine this time. They didn't bank on Castro's popularity. So they find a bunch of exiles, but those exiles tended to be the very guys who had been in Batista's army, not exactly popular figures back in Cuba. And Fidel's social revolution is profound. It's not in terms of land reform, it's in terms of literacy. He launches a program within a year to elevate the number of literates in Cuba, and that number goes up by 50% in a year of the people who can read. He starts to put schools and hospitals or medical establishments in the countryside for people who'd never had it. So now they've got this new guy in power who's giving them social services that make their lives qualitatively better, which no one had done for them yet. And the United States is sponsoring this army of the guys who had been the basically police force for the previous regime that we don't like. So the Bay of Pigs ends up being this massive disaster that the CIA sort of had gotten confident in its abilities based on Guatemala and Iran and misread the situation in Cuba. And that's when Fidel commits to communism. Right? That's when he sort of says, fine, I am now allied with the Soviet Union and I will do no trade with the United States. So that, would Fidel have ended up communist? We don't know, because that's not how it worked. But basically, he makes a lot of olive branch efforts early on. That his first trip to the United States in 1959, he doesn't say communism once. It's nationalism. It's reform. But the constant pressure, first from Eisenhower and then Kennedy, probably pushes Fidel to that corner faster than we'd anticipated. CIA won't entirely abandon its efforts at regime change, but after the Bay of Pigs, it gives up the efforts toward invasion, in part because, and I don't think I need to go over this in great detail, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's when the Soviet Union sees an opening here to sort of make the United States quake, and does this. Fidel knows it's missiles. Fidel doesn't know the United States and Soviet Union agree to withdraw the missiles, so he's furious because now he's been made to look like a puppet. But with that, part of the agreement was the United States told the Soviet Union, we will not try to invade Cuba. We will try to kill Fidel in a number of very strange ways, like they explored the possibility of an exploding seashell where he likes to scuba dive. The possibility of a poisoned wetsuit. They were going to give him a cigar that would explode. They also thought one of the weirder ones was a cigar that wouldn't kill him, it would just make his beard fall out, because everybody knows that Cubans are only respectable towards men with full facial hair, so that if his beard falls out, Cubans will see a man who's not virile enough and they'll overthrow him themselves. There have been documented at least 638 various assassination attempts, not all brought to fruition, but at least thought up. And Fidel even jokes that if there was an Olympic for surviving assassination attempts, I'd have the gold medal. But that leads into this very strained Cold War tensions, right? This becomes then sort of the United States versus Cuba as the Soviet patsy in Americas. It's in our own backyard. That apple that was supposed to be a part of the United States has now gone communist on us. How could it, after all we did for it? And from that point, though, it's a very complicated narrative, and there's not a lot of time here, so I'll sort of go through this. That's sort of how we get to that antagonism, right? That for us, that antagonism begins with Fidel Castro. But from a lot of people in Cuba's perspective, that antagonism begins back in the 1840s and 1850s. It begins when you start working on the sugar plantations. It begins when you're trying to send private armies to overtake the country. It begins with the Platt Amendment, right? That there's sort of this mutual suspicion. And that will ebb and flow across the various presidential administrations. That Johnson really doesn't focus that much on Cuba. He knows Kennedy kind of ended up with egg in his face over it, and Johnson has this other matter to deal with in Vietnam. When Nixon comes into power, he doesn't really pay that much attention to Cuba either, because he's more focused on détente. He's more focused on establishing relations with China. That there are some moves toward dealing with Cuba, so that you have a growing number of hijackings. That there are 159 hijackings in 12 years, up to 1973. And 85 of them are airplane hijackings that take planes to Cuba. And both Cuba and the United States realize this is a problem. So under Nixon, Cuba and the United States actually talk about how can we work together to prevent these hijackings, because this isn't doing either of us any good. A lot of times it's Cuban immigrants to the United States, these elites who fled, who end up being the main protagonists in these kinds of activities outside of the U.S.'s, outside of sort of U.S. sponsorship. They'll work together on things like hurricane monitoring, right? That Cuba and the United States will actually form an agreement under the Nixon years to work together to monitor the paths of hurricanes and to help each other out with the data so they could both prepare equally. Ford and Kissinger will Kissinger proposes a détente with Cuba, and Congress immediately says no, because the Cuban-American voting power is growing. The same will happen with Carter, that you'll have the Mariel boat lift with Carter. And the other thing that will sort of complicate matters in the 70s is Cuba will support one side in the Angolan Civil War for independence, and the United States supports another side. And when we learn Cuba is helping the side that's winning, we cut off talks with them. So it's a lot of give and take. It varies from president to president. Carter tries to reach some degree of rapprochement with Cuba, but by 1980, you have things like the Mariel boat lift, and 129,000 Cubans coming into the United States in about 6 months. Again, in part because Fidel doesn't send them here. He just says, all right, if you want to go, go. And he doesn't even tell the Cubans that. He tells the world that, and then Miami Cubans immediately get on boats and start heading into Cuba. And word gets out that way. So that leads sort of, the stereotype that they're all criminals. Most of them weren't. They were just sort of people who'd grown disenchanted with there is real repression. If I had an hour and a half, I would get into this. There is very real repression in Cuba. Artists, political dissidents, the gay and lesbian community are often imprisoned for their mere sexual orientation. So it's not a land of freedom. It's a social improvement that Cuba becomes the most literate country in the Western Hemisphere, that it has a life expectancy rate on par with the United States. So some of those social reforms do improve life in Cuba, but at some very real political costs. But we end up sort of seeing it as just the Cuban-American community really frames the political debate. It also accelerates under Reagan, who very much is a Cold Warrior in the old school sense of the word, of like that Cuba is just a Soviet puppet, which no one had really thought since Kennedy. But it will go through a really weird transition after Reagan. Because with Bush, he comes in also saying that Cuba is just a puppet of the Soviet Union, but then a minor thing happens where the Soviet Union ceases to exist while Bush is president. And so there's this consideration that maybe we need to reestablish relations with Cuba. But again, it's going to be those congressmen from Florida and congresswomen, Liliana Rose-Leitonen, for example, and the Cuban-American community in Florida, because by the 1990s, Florida has become one of the biggest electoral votes. And so a couple 100,000 people in Miami could actually help sway elections, that you'll have Republican candidates and Democratic candidates really kissing up to the Miami Cuban community in order to get enough votes in Miami to carry Florida to win an election. So that Clinton will sort of say, maybe we should have some rapprochement, but I know that's not going to get me elected, so I will totally say that we need regime change in Cuba. Through economic pressure and through spurring political dissidents. This is the period known as the special period because without Soviet aid, Cuba goes through a really rough spot. That you see this even on things like the streets. These are the taxis in Cuba in the 1990s because they simply don't have the infrastructure to provide repairs to either their manufacturing or to their roads. So the 90s for Cuba does look like it's about to go, and everyone's celebrating this. It'll be any day now. And yet Fidel has that annoying habit of continuing to live. And so when you get something like the Elian Gonzalez situation, right, sort of the face of Cuban-U.S. relations at the end of the 20th century, it's not a political incident. It's not one spurred by politicians, it's one spurred by people who are invested in this project. That Cuba says, the United States won't even let this kid live with his dad. Cuban Americans say, the United States won't give this kid freedom and choice. And when we get this really famous image, though this is the most, I picked this one because this is the one everyone knows. It's the most unusual one. If you look at the series of photos, the guy with the gun is talking to people. Like, it's very clearly not a tense situation, except in this one photo, which is just a freeze frame. And everyone's saying, look what Clinton did for Miami. And they remember that in 2000 when it's an election. And Bush comes in, and he's going to be the guy who brings down Castro, right? Especially after 9/11, that it restores our complicated relationships with Cuba because they're also terrorists, and so this sort of post-9/11 context, we're back to this very antagonistic rhetoric that we'd had under Reagan as well. But it's a weird one because it's after 9/11. So we talk big game about how Cuba is, totally a terrorist sponsoring country, but in terms of actual policy, we have things to do in Afghanistan and Iraq. So we talk about Cuba's value, but policy-wise, there's not much that's done. What does happen happens in Cuba, where for the first time in 2008, well, in 2006, something had never happened before happened. Fidel went into surgery and actually transferred power while he was under. He'd had surgery before, but he hadn't transferred power. But he said, all right, I'm going to be under for a little bit. We don't know what's going to happen. Raul is temporarily in charge. It's still a Castro, but that was the first time a Castro not named Fidel had been in power since 1959. And in 2008, Fidel actually steps down and says Raul is now the next president. And Cuba realizes that even the Castros can't live forever. And so you have an actual Cuban Communist Party that's beginning to move toward reform. There's a lot of jostling of power behind the scenes, which the readings talk about a little bit of what branch will sort of win out in this one. But through it all, right, that Fidel had been the constant. That by the end of in the later years of his term, George W. Bush says, well, someone said, well, what about Castro? Like, well, God will decide. Even he sort of throws his hands up. Like, clearly, there have been 10 of us now. We haven't been able to figure it out. It's up to God. And that gets us to where we are today. Because even as this has been going on, there's been a pretty dramatic transformation, here we are, in US public opinion. Even while Miami Cubans have mobilized increasingly against any sense of rapprochement with Fidel or Raul because they're about to fall, the embargo's about to work, the US public attitude on the issue has transformed pretty dramatically in the last 10 years. That you've had moments where congressmen or certain members of political parties or the public said this seems silly, but it was never to the degree that it is now. Where for the first time in public opinion polls, it's pretty much split on whether or not we should even have the embargo, and establishing relations with Cuba is increasingly favored. And so the decision last year for Obama to renew relations with Cuba wasn't some sort of top-down imposed thing on American society necessarily, but for the first time in 40 years, a policy that actually reflected the general sentiment of the American public. And even if you break it down further, I didn't want to bore you all with charts, but even if you break it down by party, within the Republican Party itself, which was sort of seen as the staunchest anti-Castro, anti-renewal sentiment or bastion, it's about tied now. It's like 49% in favor of restoring relations, 48% against. That basically every demographic you could look at, there's a general trend towards saying, if it hasn't worked up to this point. Right? And so that's sort of where we are today then, is that just the beginning of this year, or late last year, for the first time since 1959, the flag of each of the two countries flew in the other country. That we opened up embassies. There's a move toward rapprochement. It's not necessarily a concession toward Castro or even toward that regime, but the basic premise behind the Obama administration decision is 50 plus years of embargo, 56 years of embargo, didn't bring them down. Maybe by increasing contact and letting people in Cuba see what kinds of things the United States can offer them politically and or economically, instead of cutting them off from those things, maybe that's the way you implement real change in Cuba. And so that's gotten us to where we are today. But again, it's been part of what's been a very fraught, long, and complicated history, that the antagonisms between Cuba and the United States are not anything particularly new. It's just the forms that they take have been unusual and variant. And now we might actually be on the cusp of a fundamentally different age in Cuba and the United States relations. And it's from here to see where that will take us. Thank you. Yes, sir.
After the Castros are gone, do you have any idea what the new leadership is going to look like?
I bet it's going to be a man. I don't. I think it'll probably be the party trying to sort of do, I think it's going to be closer to what you sort of saw in China under Deng Xiaoping, where you institutionalize it. And I think that's why Fidel stepped down, because some said, oh, he must be about to die because he's stepping down. Why would he do that if he's not going to die? I think he realized sort of, here's how to, if I may sort of draw an analog to Venezuela, where all of the power was in the person of Chavez. And when Chavez died, there hadn't been any sort of institutionalization of the program he wanted to implement for his country. And I'm not going to get into the merits of that program, but simply the practicality of he had a vision for the country, but he made it such a personalist project and a personalist image that when he died, now Venezuela's in a mess. I think the Castros both realized that they've been around long enough and seen enough changes in the world to understand how politics work, and that the institutionalization is better. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's some sort of quiet, behind-the-scenes, knowledgeable but not inflammatory builder, rather than a fire breather. But beyond that, I'm not real confident. I don't know who it would be, but I think that's what they're trying to do, is find someone who can be stable, young enough to keep it going, but old enough to have been part of, to be a firm believer in the project. You had your hand up, and then I'll go over here, and then back over there. Yes, go ahead.
I applaud you for an even-handed approach to this subject. What worried me is when you talked about Eisenhower's embargo, it wasn't just the U.S.
Right.
He enforced other countries
Yes.
to not do this.
Yeah, so the U.S. does use the Organization of American States and basically tells all those countries, if you like getting money from us, you'll vote to cut off Cuba. And you have other instances like that. So the Helms-Burton Act in the 1990s is really damaging on that front, because what it is the United States basically says, if you're a foreign economic private enterprise, like you're, I don't know, the Canadian version of Colgate or whatever, and you sell in Cuba, our citizens can sue you for the money you're making in Cuba. So we try to make it so other countries can't even trade with Cuba, which, if you're like, oh, I love the free market, well, that ain't it. And it's very much because it's Jesse Helms, right, who's very much an old school, fire-breathing, anti-communist Cold Warrior. So he still is convinced that Clinton's just getting soft. He thinks the Cold War has ended. But Clinton does sign that bill into effect. And once he does that, he basically cedes Cuban foreign policy to Congress.
I was there 4 years ago. One of the first groups that got to go there. It was a wonderful experience to get to talk to young people who don't remember so much of the history to talk about.
Yeah, someone was asking for, I hoped to go in 2002 because I was going to be abroad in Costa Rica. And before 9/11, it was really easy to go illegally from another country, and the penalties were very small. But then 9/11 happened, and the penalty went from if you get caught, it's like $500. It was like, now it'll be $10,000. Well, I'm a college student. I might have been able to swing 500. I can't swing 10,000 if I get caught. So I ended up not going. Yes, sir. Right here, and then.
And the sugar trade. How about the sugar trade in prison?
They've tried to move beyond, and that was part of the problem. One of the challenges Castro faced was he tried to industrialize Cuba with Soviet technology in the 60s, but basically the way that economic trade ended up working was it was just sugar for industry. So they still ended up enormously dependent upon sugar. It's just now they were dependent on exporting sugar to the Soviet Union instead of to the United States. And the Soviet Union promised that it'd buy above world market prices. Currently, it's they've tried to diversify their economy so that you've had, and these are part of the real reforms you have seen in the last several years, is like even back to the 90s, the Castros, I'll call it at this point the Castros regime, they've allowed some degree of small private enterprise. So small farming, small agricultural production, small store production. Like, it's not communist in the way we think or that we've been told. It has been state regulated, but they've begun opening it up to try to diversify the economy. But the big elephant in the room has continued to be the U.S. embargo, because it makes it harder to trade with, like even other countries that were going to trade with, try to set up sort of, benefit from a free market in the 90s. Once the Helms-Burton Act passes, that gets cut off. So Cuba's sort of it's at a very uncertain point with regards to that. That's partly why the restoration of relations matters so much. You had a question, and then I'll come back over here, and then I'll jump around as much as I can.
Other than tourism, which I'm assuming will open up fairly rapidly. What does Cuba have to begin rebuilding their economy? Do they have any natural resources? I mean, I don't.
Right. Regarding the natural resources, not much. The Spanish managed to take out what they could in the 1500s. Cigars, they really are good. They're so good. Sugar, the Cuban rum industry is still infamous, or famous, I should say, the world over for its quality. I mean, the Bacardis can say what they want about being from Cuba, but they're not there anymore. And but it would be, I think tourism would really be the big one.
Are a lot of American companies itching to get back in there?
I think so, yeah.
Well, the cruise companies, I got advertisements last November
Yeah.
about the cruises that are already going right now.
But this comes back to that question too. That's why I think it's going to be very much a sort of steady top-down control because, and frankly, I don't blame them entirely because like if all those companies are basically can't wait to do what it used to be like in the 1850s and 1890s and 1920s again, I would say we're going to take our time on this one. But yeah, there are a lot of companies dying to get in and hope to replicate that.
Is that new leadership also going to be able to control themselves from taking that?
I think so because the my guess is, I think so because the Helms-Burton Act wouldn't be in effect, so then it is actually once again a sort of free market. It's sort of like it's a really weird thing, a state-guided free market, where the state regulates the internal market but determines on the global free market who's the best bidder and gives us the best deals. So that in that regard, I think so, yes. Yes, sir.
That story you were telling about the boat people back in 1980,
Yeah.
I can't help thinking that if Donald Trump were running for president in 1980, he would have said, I'll put them all on an ocean liner and ship them all back to Cuba.
There's talk about that, but Fidel basically said, look, if you're, because part of the problem too was the Congress at that time in the United States was really pushing for, oh, poor Cuba, won't somebody help the Cubans? So all Fidel does with the boat lift is basically, all right, if you feel that bad for him and want to give him a new opportunity, here's your chance. Sort of put your money where your mouth is, and then all of a sudden you have all these politicians who sort of deeply regretted what they had said about that. It's such a different context, it's tough to say. I mean, Reagan didn't love having, and it is bad news for Carter. There's a number of things that go against Carter in the 80 election, but it's not a good look for him, and Reagan does exploit it heavily.
Well, I was sort of saying that tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
My actual question was, I haven't heard anything from Fidel in several years. I assume he's still alive.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that he died.
He's still around.
I just wondered, has he ever, or is he planning to write his memoirs? It occurs to me,
I
I'm no
hope
fan
so.
of Castro, but
God, I hope
he's been
so.
on the world stage for 60 years.
Yeah.
What stories he could tell if he wanted to sincerely do that, and I wonder, has he any plans to write his memoirs?
I don't know. I mean, it's against hope, but I hope against hope that he just is at the point he's like, I've lived so long that when I'm dead, who cares? I've left my mark. I'm telling everything exactly as it happened, and it's going to be 3,000 pages, and I will read every one of them. But I haven't seen anything saying he's worked on his memoirs. Back there, and then up here, and then back over here. Yes, sir.
Why are so many Cuban Americans against normalization of Cuba?
Because they have a stake in it. They think, this is where I'm going to start to get a little less even-handed, but I'll do my best. There's not a good way to put it. They think they have a stake in it. Because that first generation that came over, they were the ones profiting off of stuff. And Fidel loves that they left, not because they were enemies, but because all of a sudden there's all this stuff he could give to people. It's like, oh, did you ever want a home? Here you go. Oh, did you ever want land? Because I happen to have 5,000 acres that just came into my possession because they fled. So an acre for you and an acre for you, so that you have all the rural people saying, this is great, I own land for the first time in my life. And it becomes really dogmatic. The anti-Fidel hatred is as dogmatic as anything in the Cold War. So that you have these exiles who are, I mean, one of them that we have in the United States, he served time in prison here, but he blew up a Cuban jetliner and killed 85 people to make a statement against Fidel, operating independently of the CIA. It's hard to explain why do people just have such an irrational hatred for people sometimes that they just turn them into the villain. And the thing is, and I've heard this it's not as common now. The younger generation of Cuban Americans, they think it's kind of crazy and silly. because they weren't invested in that. And at this point, they realized, look, mom and dad, or grandma and grandpa, even if they're overthrown tomorrow and it's all the way it was in 1959, you're not getting that land back. You can't rewind, you can't put the genie back in the bottle on the land ownership, the medical care, the literacy. The Cuba you think you're going back to stopped existing in 1959, but there is a sort of broader sense that we need to make it the way it used to. And it just becomes this, I can't even think of an analogy. Like, it makes people on MSNBC or Fox News talking about the other party's leader look sane by comparison. Yeah.
What is Rose's relationship with Putin?
It's not strong. I mean, it's not weak, but he's just another world leader that he could work with. But it's not Russia has its own problems. I mean, it has since 1991. So Russia's pretty much been a non-entity for Cuba since 1991. Like, they tried for a couple of years and then basically said, look, we've got our own problems. You're on your own. So yeah, his relationship with Putin is the same as it would be with Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, or with Cameron in England, or the president of France. It's another world leader, and you work with world leaders. Yes?
Couple comments.
Sure.
When you spoke about the Spanish-American War, I was surprised you didn't have a comment about Randolph Hearst and his role.
Well, yeah, he definitely, in spurring it, right, the yellow journalism, that you give me the headlines, I'll give you the war. They really facilitate the popular opinion, but once the war starts, it's sort of beyond their control.
The other comment is that in 1959, I was a pilot stationed at a SAC base in Homestead, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And things were starting to get rather tense. We kept bombers in the air all the time, 24 hours a day with atomic weapons. The biggest impact, though, in 1959 to our base down there in the economy was that we could no longer make our monthly runs to Cuba for their rum.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody drank Cuba Libres until then, and after that we had to look for other sources of
Yeah, a lot of people weren't, early on, I would say, to characterize it, would sort of be top-down problems, and since then it's sort of been a broader sort of segments of society that are angry about this that managed to make it an issue. Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea what is the population of Cuba compared to the population of the Cuban heritage live outside, say, the Miami area?
In Miami, at most, it's like multiple generations now, at most between 500,000 and 1 million. But that's like great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and kids, sort of the tree branching. It's much higher in Cuba, the percentage. But yeah, it's small. It used to be about 400,000 people in the 90s. Which always just drove me nuts. It's like, well, here's 400,000 people helping to determine an entire election for a country of 290 million people. Yes, ma'am.
What is the status of Guantanamo?
That's one of the big questions about normalizing relations, because Cuba insists that it's got to go. Like, that's got to be our land again. We can't let you just have a base here any longer. I sort of think that's the big question for this one is timing, because had it been 5 years ago, Obama had time to work this out, but now he doesn't, so it depends on who gets elected this year. I know some people would say that it's absolutely vital to our security interests. I would be inclined to disagree with that, and it's just simply going to depend on who ends up in the White House then to determine. So the status of Guantanamo is pending November of this year is what I would say.
Wasn't there a lease on Guantanamo, like the Panama Canal? Does that run?
No, there was a lease, but we basically decided that we were just going to renew it in perpetuity, and if they didn't like it, they could come push us off. Yes, sir.
Anytime you see a film about Cuba, you see all these beautiful cars in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do to get those back?
It's very sad, because some people say, like, oh God, why would, like, to come back to the question about, are there any businesses dying to gain there? The secondhand car industry just wants to gobble up every one of those and sell them for millions of dollars here. Because and the joke is, people with the other things, like, well, what do Cubans do? Mechanics. Because if they can make a 59 Chevy still run in 2016, they know it, without having the industry to build the parts themselves, they know what they're doing with cars. So yeah, it's funny you say it, because that's actually a possible niche market where you could go in and offer a Cuban $300,000 for their car and bring it back to the States and sell it for $1 million. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.